Thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor to talk to you all. It's been amazing just to spend a few minutes hearing about ABA in Russian-speaking countries and about this community. So I'm very excited to share. I'm Joanna Staubiz. I am at Vanderbilt University, where I am an assistant professor and I direct the Applied Behavior Analysis Master's Program. But before I say any more about any of that, I do want to acknowledge the many people who contributed to the study that I'm going to share with you today. So I want to acknowledge the many people who contributed to the study I will share with you, from the staff at the school where we collected the data and the students there, behavior analysts at Vanderbilt Kennedy Center Triad, Western New England University. And I absolutely want to thank all of the graduate students at Vanderbilt who have since gone on to do other things, who helped in tremendous ways with this project. Mira Montgomery being one of those people who worked actively with one of the clients whose data you'll see today. Right, and just really quickly about me, just to sort of set the context here. I am a former special education teacher and a behavioral analyst who worked in the local school district. Yes, and in that work, I primarily worked with students with emotional and behavioral disorders, or the students for whom their behavior problems couldn't be attributed to intellectual or other health factors. That work led to some research questions, which is how I ended up where I am now. And so most of my work is training pre-service practitioners to work with those students. And that is where I also do research. It's kind of opportunistic, so it's has to be dynamic, and you'll see what I. And I'll just acknowledge that my point of view is as someone who lives and works in the U.S. and knows that educational system well, and I know that's really not necessarily going to map on to the education systems that you all are in. Yeah, so in the United States, emotional and behavioral disorders are pretty prevalent. There's an estimated 11 to 20% of students are impacted. These students have limited access to behavioral health services compared to other populations. And their language repertoires are, and their rule-governed behavior repertoires are variable, but they're strong relative to other populations who have specific behavioral support needs or a lot of problem behavior. Despite their strong language repertoires, relatively speaking, they do have documented difficulties communicating their needs, tolerating being told no when they ask for something, and cooperating with academic instruction in areas of deficit. So given those deficits, skill-based treatment is a really nice match because it targets those exact things: communication, tolerance, and cooperation. And in skill-based treatment, intermittent and unpredictable schedules of synthesized reinforcement are applied to each of these alternatives to problem behavior, which sort of raises the question, okay, we're reinforcing alternative responses, but how do we respond to problem behavior? You know, as in any function-based intervention package, initially the plan was withhold reinforcement for problem behavior, use extinction to expedite behavior change. Escape extinction in particular, so we've got, you know, positive and negative reinforcement extinction, but escape extinction is one of the most common components of function-based intervention in schools in the US. So there are multiple variants on extinction, escape extinction. So it could be that you simply continue to repeat the prompt. It could be that you physically guide, and there are other variations as well. So physical guidance is something that is a problem. A lot of these kids have academic deficits, and so we're reinforcing their cooperation and not reinforcing problem behavior. Some of those limitations include the documented collateral effects or the extinction burst that most of us are familiar with, that temporary increase in rate and variability in responding, and extinction-induced aggression. And also, physical guidance as a component of escape extinction itself can evoke problem behavior. So in this study, a procedure including physical guidance actually elevated levels of destructive behavior that were eliminated by removing that physical prompt. So physical guidance can actually worsen problem behavior in the short term. And while physical guidance and restraint shouldn't be conflated, they're not the same thing. Physical guidance can escalate to restraint or isolation. And this happens all too often and can have devastating outcomes. These are some examples of news stories in the last 5 years or so of when physical guidance and restraint have gone wrong and children have been harmed. And I will add one more thing here, and that's disability communities have been vocal about the damage that has been done to people via ABA because the practices have been overly coercive. And many folks, if you take to social media, you'll see that many folks who experience ABA as children say that they've been traumatized by it. And so this is just something we really have to be mindful of. It's like, how are we affecting the clients in other ways than reducing the problem behavior that we can measure and put on a graph? Furthermore, several groups have argued that physical management is contraindicated for clients who've experienced trauma, and many children with problem behavior have, if not all. So physical guidance can cause psychological distress. Finally, on this point, assent is really important, given all of that. So we need to be giving clients the option to choose to participate in therapy, or at least considering that more than we have historically, than making those decisions for clients. I'm so wordy that that's perfect. That's what should. Well, the first study on the method that I'm going to talk about today was published in 2021. It included 2 participants from my lab. And that is why we really liked how those students responded to this intervention package, and so did the school staff. And we included students who belong to minoritized populations and are economically disadvantaged. So we were really trying to reach kids who otherwise would not have access to ABA. So the first research question was whether an enhanced choice model, so that's, I'm going to say ECM from here on out, of skill-based treatment is efficacious for skill acquisition and problem behavior reduction. And it's that enhanced choice model wherein we're dealing with the problems of physical management and assent. And I'll tell you more about it in a minute. And we were also interested in exploring whether school staff were able to obtain similar effects to those obtained by research staff. And the context in which we did this work was in a specialized public school for students who are eligible for special education services at a time. So they're eligible for special education. So I guess what I would say here about the setting is that it was a special school for kids who problem behavior is dangerous enough that they needed something different, so much so that the government is providing funding for them to have extra services. And I will tell you a little bit about the participants here. So there were 3 participants ranging from 7 to 9 years old, and you can see more information about them on the screen. And you'll notice that they all have deficits in both reading and math, and in some other academic areas as well, but all in reading and math, and some language impairment as well. Alrighty, so let's talk about procedures. I will try to be clear and brief. We begin with a functional analysis, a practical functional assessment that involves an interview where we learn as much as we can for each individual child what is contributing to problem behavior in the classroom. Okay. Yeah, the influences on problem behavior. So for each student, we look at the specific forms and styles of attention, specific play items and routines that influence problem behavior, specific academic tasks and other educational tasks that evoke or influence problem behavior. And in that synthesized contingency, we're identifying and including all those things. We are also ensuring we're complying with all child demands. We're doing what the child tells us to do as part of this reinforcement contingency that we're developing. And once we have that, we manipulate that contingency and we look at what happens in the presence of all those reinforcers or potential reinforcers. And that's what we mean by synthesized, that's all put together. Let me put it this way. We put all of these things together into one context. Then we evaluate whether problem behavior happens when all of that's available. We also evaluate whether problem behavior happens when we take that stuff away. We try out those contingencies. These are individualized, and for each student, let me orient you here. The y-axes are problem behavior per minute, rate of problem behavior, and then x-axis is session number. Those circles represent the test condition. That's where we're removing the reinforcer and reinstating it contingent on problem behavior. And open squares represent the control condition, where freely available reinforcement. Open squares represent the control condition where all the reinforcers are freely available. And you can see, looking across these, there's really no overlap. There's clear differences in how kids performed in test versus control. So for us, we said that's enough. We can use this context to teach skills. And to do that, here we are with the skill-based treatment process. We begin with functional communication training, and that involves shaping a response from a simple, low-effort version to something more complex. That involves shaping a simple, low-effort response into something more complex. They, for example, teach a student to say "my way," and then we require them to say "my way, please." And when they master that, "May I have my way, please?" A bid for attention at the beginning, like an "excuse me." And once that response is super strong and is going to show up no matter what we do to disrupt reinforcement, we begin to occasionally deny it after it's really strong. Yep. And at that point, we're working on the tolerance response, which often looks like the student simply saying "okay," and then we reinforce that. And once that is mastered, we go on to periodically reinforce both of those skills, the communication skill, the tolerance response, and start to incorporate cooperation. And in that cooperation training phase, we're also, at the same time as we're reinforcing all these different responses, increasing the difficulty and the number of tasks. And that is where enhanced choice comes in. So those are our intervention procedures, our kind of therapeutic procedures, and they fit into this broader context. So broadly, the enhanced choice model involves giving students access to alternative contexts than just intervention. And the goal of doing this is for those alternatives to function as abolishing operations. Goal here is for those responses, as they're allocated to alternative contexts, that it's in and of itself is another replacement for problem behavior. Basically, if things get too stressful during intervention, the student can do other things than engage in problem behavior to get away from the stress. So what this looks like is that the first context is practice, and that's where skill-based treatment. Yep, and in this context, trained responses are reinforced. Problem behavior is on extinction via repeating the task demands, but no physical guidance. The second context, or in other words, the first alternative to skill-based treatment, is hangout. And hangout is characterized by non-contingent reinforcement. Participants can either say they want hangout, or want to go to hangout, or they can physically enter the space. Contingent on either form of manned for hangout, therapists immediately stop establishing operations, and provide reinforcement. Reinforcement in hangout is almost identical to reinforcement in skill-based treatment. Differences are that it's freely available, not earned, and the quality of attention is lower. Just to help make it more concrete, there are no demands presented. All of the toys and tangible items are available that the student has been using in treatment. And adults will answer questions, but they won't play with the child. So hangout is as awesome as we can make it, while still not being quite as awesome as reinforcement in the practice context. And there's another alternative, and that's simply to leave the session overall. In a school building, this looked like going to class or wherever they had come from for the session. And we let them leave and return as much as they wanted during the scheduled appointment time. This was really important because sometimes their class would be like watching a movie or having popcorn. And if we didn't allow them to leave, we might have had some big problems because they really wanted to be there. Of course, finally, again, no physical guidance used whatsoever. Definitely, I'll just be honest with you, it was really weird for me at first to provide these alternatives. I thought, oh my gosh, these kids aren't going to learn anything. Why would they ever choose to work with us? Yeah, so if you're feeling skeptical, I get it. I did too. And so I'll show you what happened. One student, the most evocative conditions for her were being asked to move her body. So to require her to go to a separate area for hangout was a really big barrier. Yes, and this is actually not a student in this study, but I wanted to talk about individualizing a little bit. So for that student, we made a card, and so she just flipped it. So she stayed where she was, and we just changed our behavior. So hangout was not a physical space, but it was what we did. And it's really important to think about this because we want it to be very easy for them to get into hangout. So Kendrick, one of the participants whose data you will see, he had been asked to stand up, and that's the point at which he wanted to opt out into hangout and not follow instructions, but he had to stand up to get to hangout. And instead he rolled onto the bottom of a cart and rolled himself into hangout. So we want them to get there. So we thought, oh my gosh, oops, glad that worked out. Finally, our verbal interactions with the students were really, really important. We engaged them in regular discussion about their goals and the procedures of the intervention and incorporated their feedback whenever we could. Oh, not finally. The last little bit of procedures here, then we can look at some data. We met with classroom teams. We individualized or customized the demands to match the classroom context. And we prepared the students a little bit by starting to rotate the people who were presenting demands to them and leading practice sessions. Then we had to train the staff to implement the procedures, which was pretty hard. And I'm sure all of you have done some training on complex procedures and can relate. And I should have put this in here, but we actually did a separate study at this time on staff training, which has been published. And I can send you the citation for that if you want it later on. So we used BST for this, but we did incorporate video models and we had to really play with. Awesome. And now let's take a look at what happened here. And these figures are pretty close to the ones that are published, although they like different, but the same conclusions can be drawn. But these are, I apologize, these are monsters. Then we'll look at little parts at a time, one at a time. Alrighty, so for each participant, we have one of these. The top tier displays, closed circles are rates of problem behavior per minute. And also the gray bars are the percentage of session time in reinforcement. Second tier displays rate of functional communicative responding, rate of the tolerance response. Fourth tier is the percentage of demands cooperated with. And the bottom tier is response allocation among the different contexts available. The black portions of the bars represent time and reinforcement. The white portions represent time in the establishing operation. The gray portions represent time in hangout. And the pattern portions represent the leave context, so when they went back to class. So to address that first research question about effects on skills and problem behavior, you can see there were elevated rates of problem behavior in baseline that were eliminated in functional communication training. You can also see, if you do some vertical analysis here, that as problem behavior decreased, we see functional communicative responses increase in rate. And at this point, we've not yet had opportunity to evaluate tolerance or compliance, although there were demands presented in the EO, but they weren't required to cooperate to access reinforcement. And finally, in this bottom tier, this is our response allocation across contexts. You can see that they're just in session. They're not, this student, Carlos, was not using hangout or leave at this stage. All he had to do at this point was say my way as soon as we started to interfere, and we reinstated reinforcement. So there was no need to opt out. Now we can look a little further out. So once we started shaping the functional communicative response, and minimal challenging behavior here, and this was not dangerous behavior, it was precursor behavior. So signs of behavior, I should have talked about that earlier, I apologize. Then, tolerance training, same thing, like little bumps in non-dangerous behavior until we had a big burst at the end here and had to go back to complex for a while. This was because the iPad wasn't working. It's coming back to me. So then we reestablished the tolerance response, and we're able to move on. Then to look down at these other tiers, you can see elevated rates of functional communicative responses. They do decrease, but they should because sessions get longer. Okay. Yes, and then, once we started denying demand occasionally and reinforcing a tolerance response, we see those rates increase, remain relatively stable, or not yet reinforcing or requiring any kind of compliance or cooperation, but we had a little burst in cooperation, which is not a bad thing. And here's the remaining sessions until generalization for the same participant, Carlos. So during demand fading or cab chaining, this is the part where we are requiring cooperation. We start to see a little more variability in problem behavior. And we noticed a little burst in problem behavior on this day. And it turned out the teacher had said, you have to stay in there or you can't have a snack later. So it's almost like a little idea of what it might be like if we don't have that alternative. You can see that time and reinforcement is decreasing across these sessions. So he's spending more time doing work and cooperating. And another way to look at that is here in the compliance tier. So you see kind of moderate percentages of compliance, but then they kind of hop up to near 100% and are pretty stable as those demands increase in number and difficulty. And looking down at response allocation, you can see that as demands increased in number and difficulty, so did allocation to hang out and leave. And it makes sense. Like the harder the work is, the more breaks I need. So this is a life skill. All right. And finally, and I will speed up a little bit, this is the generalization phase. We'll just look at all of it together. Variability in problem behavior when staff implemented, but solid rates of FCRs, tolerance responses, and percent compliance, and less allocation to alternative contexts. And I'll add that for leave in the classroom, so he's back in his class with other students and his teacher, it looked like doing what the other students were doing rather than this format of instruction, skill-based treatment. All right, and I will be much more brief with these other participants. So here's second participant, Theo, similar patterns with problem behavior and alternatives, similar outcomes for cooperation or compliance, and similar outcomes for generalization here. It was a little rockier at the beginning with classroom staff, but able to reach feeling levels. I should point out nearly zero problem behavior also throughout. Then similar to Carlos, the allocation to hang out and leave only started once things got harder during instructional fading or cab chaining. And we had to individualize a bit, but the details are in the paper. And then similar to Carlos, even though the alternatives were available once the work was being done in the classroom, he didn't use them. He just participated. And finally, Kendrick, our third participant, he did not have as many sessions. We started later. Similar patterns across the board, except here, he had much more problem behavior, but really low percentages of dangerous problem behavior. And I'm sorry, I should, in the graph distinguishes between these. So the graph in the paper will show you that breakdown. Kendrick had the most challenging behavior of all the students. And despite that, we were able to get him to participate in instruction. And this is a kid who would not do anything. So it meant something, even though there's a little bit of their behavior, the fact that he was working is very important. And interestingly, he rarely used the alternatives. So based on these data, the treatment was efficacious for relatively safely increasing skills and reducing problem behavior. It's an empirical question, but we believe there would have been more dangerous behavior if they were not allowed to opt out, particularly Carlos and Theo, right? And we also learned that kids really preferred to practice. So just to summarize, across participants, they averaged something like 85% of their time allocated to practice and only 50% to hang out and leave. And, we noticed that happened most during that demand fading or cab chaining part where we're requiring students to engage with work. The alternatives might be best used there. So essentially without sacrificing efficacy, ECM allowed us to create opportunities for students to practice taking a break, essentially, and programming those concurrent alternatives meant students had ongoing opportunities to assent to choose to participate or not. We were also able to use those data formatively and kind of look at what are the things we're doing that predict when they leave or hang out, and are there things we can change to make it more pleasant for them. And I'm just going to skip this part and wrap it up here because I know I've gone really far over. But I think I'll just wrap it up to say it's important that we continue to investigate ways to provide choice within our treatments so that we can provide ongoing opportunities to assent, but also keep things really safe for students. And that's really important because in ABA, we're looking at data points on paper, and those are important data, whether the behavior we're measuring is changing, but there's a lot more to the client than just that. So safety and autonomy are really critical. That's it. Thank you. That must have been exhausting. You're amazing.